The Austrian and Austro-Hungarian M1861 NCO and enlisted man's sabre. All about it right now. Hi, I'm Peter and welcome back to the History and Sabre Suite, the channel where I talk about HEMA, history and swords. And as promised on my Instagram a week ago, this is the video about the Austrian and later Austro-Hungarian M1861 Infanterie Man's Sabre. So basically this is the literal translation of Infanterie-Mannschaftssäbel, and I'm going to go over the different models over the course of the 19th century. There were three distinctive Infanterie-Mannschaftssäbel. This is the latest one, the 1861 version. And I'm going to go all the way back to the 18th century where this whole trend started. I'm going to tell you what this is compared to the infantry officer's sabre, how it compares and who carried it, how it was used, and so on. Now let's get right into the video. Alright, so going all the way back to the 18th century, it was still common for enlisted men, so private soldiers, to carry swords as sidearms, not just bayonets, but also short sabres, like these, for example. In the Habsburg army, we have the 1765 and 84 infantry sabres. These are simple brass-hilted sabres with a simple cross for hand protection. And these were carried by private soldiers, grenadiers, infantrymen, and so on. Now, by the end of the Napoleonic period and into the 1820s and 30s, this became less and less. On the one hand, it was too expensive to equip every single private soldier with a sidearm, and it also wasn't commonplace anymore in general. Talking about the first model of Austrian, or Habsburg in this case, infantry enlisted man's sabre. First model is the 1836 pattern, Infanterie-Mannschaftssäbel, and this thing was very similar in appearance to, let me just grab it real quick, to the British 1796 pattern light cavalry sabre, as you can see here. So basically it had a single knuckle bow, a stirrup hilt, no langets, mind you, but the guard was very similar, and it was basically based on a generic kind of style of European sabres that was common not just in Britain, but also in Prussia and in the Habsburg lands as well. So just think 1796 light cavalry sabre with a flared guard towards the end. This is typical for the Austrian 1837 infantry officer's sabre and the enlisted man's sabre. Now, the reason it's called enlisted man's sabre is basically just tradition, because in the 18th century, as I said, enlisted men actually carried sidearms, swords. Now, in 1836, it was decided that a new regulation pattern of enlisted man's sabre, Mannschaftssäbel, was to be introduced. And this was basically to have a simplified and regulated pattern for all grenadiers. So grenadiers still carried these sabres, so even the private soldiers, and NCOs carried these, and also personnel in special functions such as musicians. Now, compared to the officer's sabre, the 1837, the 1836 NCO or enlisted man's sabre was of a wedge section, so an unfolded blade. It's a very simple design, and just like the British example I have here, it had a leather-wrapped grip, and what's very characteristic of the 1796 that I'm holding right here is the shape of the rear quillen here. That's also triangular in shape, and the Austrian enlisted man's sabre looked exactly like that. Now, this worked for a few years, decades you could even say, until the year 1851, when it was decided that over the years there had been a lot of variation again, and production standards were not up to the original pattern. So once again, it was decided that a new pattern should be adopted, and it's called the 1836/51 pattern. And the only real difference between the earlier ones, so the first version and the second version, was the backstrap. So you had, instead of a completely rounded backstrap, you had these lines. So you have a flatter surface instead of a completely rounded backstrap. The same thing was done on the 1861 later, but it came in originally in 1851. It was also decided that the 51 version would be carried by grenadiers and NCOs, regardless of branch. So it basically became an NCO Sabre, already partly in 36 and in 51 even more so. So basically all three versions would be more accurately described as the infantry NCO Sabre. Now in 1861, new cavalry sword regulations came in. So we have the Unified Universal Cavalry Sabre M1861. And because swords were talked about and thought about and designed a lot in that time, they also decided to give the enlisted man's or NCO Sabre an update. And this is what I'm holding right here. So this is the 1861 pattern infantry NCO or enlisted man's sabre, the latest of the most recent of the three versions. And now I'm going to talk about the differences between this and the 61 officer's sabre, because on the surface they look very similar. First of all, this is still a short sabre. So in English you will call this a hanger maybe, but in German it's just a sabre, really. The main difference between this, besides the length, I have it here, it's 65.5 centimeters, so it's a really short blade. So the main difference, apart from the length, is it has a hatchet point. It shares the hatchet point with all three versions, so the 36, the 3651 and the 61 all have a hatchet point, whereas the 1861 infantry officer's sabre has a spear point. So basically that means that the point terminates in the middle of the blade rather than at the back of the blade. Compared to the 36 version, this is a fullered blade. So you have a single fuller on both sides. And this is also incidentally a change that came in for the 51 version as well. And it's also a bit more curved usually than the officer's blade. Now, we have the guard and the hilt still to talk about. Now, if I come closer, the main difference, and I'll grab the British 1796 light cavalry sword again. The main difference here is the shape of the guard. Now, both the 1836 infantry NCO Sabre and the 51 update both feature a rectangular shape right here, whereas this more closely follows the later Austrian and Austro-Hungarian tradition of this kind of S-shaped guard maybe. But what it retains is the flared rear guard that it shares across all the generations. And what's interesting about the example I have right here is that usually the grip was supposed to be black leather, and this example right here is shagreen, so fish skin, what's usually found on an officer's sword. And this one has a really nice black anthracite, dark grayish color to it. So it was dyed in a very dark color, and as you can see, it's in perfect condition, and it's really quite beautiful actually. It's in mint condition, I would say. very little use, very little signs of handling. And the other main difference, as I already talked about, is the shape of the rear quiller. 1796 is triangular, and on this it generally follows the 1861 officer's version, just with a slight difference, and that is the missing slots here for the sword knots, which are usually found up right here. So 2 slots like this. And if you've seen my 1861 officers video, you will know what I'm talking about. So yeah, it's kind of a mix between the old traditions found in the early 19th century, this shape here, and yeah, it lost its triangular shape that was quite common in the early 19th century based on this type of sword. And yeah, it has a shagreen grip instead of leather, which is kind of an upgrade. A shorter blade terminates in a hatchet point, and that's basically all there is to say about this saber. And I don't know about you, but I readily admit that I don't find the Austrian infantry design of the late 19th century particularly attractive if compared to the British designs, for example. But as a sword, as a saber, this is actually a really nice saber. It's short, it's light. I think it's 605 grams. I measured it a week ago, but that's what it was, I think, 605 grams, which is not overly light, but it is very manageable. And the point of balance is around, I'd say, maybe, what's that? I'll measure it right now. 15, 14, yeah, 14 centimeters exactly. So it still has quite some force to it if you cut with it, but it's a very light and fairly nimble sword as well. Flexibility is great, so it's quite rigid as it should be, but not overly so. Nice little sword. And what I really like about this blade, as you can see, it's Solingen made, German made blade. Distal taper. I really like the distal taper on these original swords because it's very thick. I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, it starts out very thick at the base and tapers down to, I would say, a millimeter less than that already in the first few centimeters. So it's quite thick at the base. That's very typical. So it's 6.5 millimeters here. I measured it. And it's already, I'd say, maybe 5.5 millimeters down here. And in the center of the blade, let me see, it's 3 millimeters in width. And just before it tapers to the tip, it's only 1.5 millimeters around here. So distal taper is very nice. It's a very lively blade. And yeah, it's a lovely little sword. And the cutler that made all the rest and put it together into one piece was a cutler from Budapest who is quite well known. I've seen a few cavalry swords by him. He's called Boholek György, so basically Boholek George, if you will. And he was a sword cutler in Budapest, also manufacturer of scabbards. It's a very nice sword. What can be said about this particular example as well is the acceptance mark. So the stamp right here, it says S, then the double-headed eagle, which is just the Army Depot acceptance mark, and 6. So S usually stands for Armee Schießschule, which was the Army shooting school is the literal translation. So it was basically the army training facility for marksmanship in Lower Austria. So it was probably carried by an NCO of this institution. And that's why it has the S on here on the ricasso. Now let me wrap things up. If you like this video, please give me a like and also subscribe to my channel so you're not missing out on my future content. I really hope you enjoyed the video and please leave your thoughts in the comments down below. On that note, thanks for watching and see you next time. Bye bye.